Imagine you're the most powerful man in Mexico. You control every gram of illegal merchandise crossing the border. You have governors on your payroll, generals who shake your hand, and a fortune so vast that even you can't count it. Now imagine all of that crumbling. One day you're having dinner in your Guadalajara mansion, and the next you're handcuffed in a cell, blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, doing gardening work for 400 pesos a week. That's what happened to one of the men in this story. But there are others who never even got the chance to grow old. Because the Guadalajara Cartel, Mexico's first major criminal organization, met an end that no one could have predicted when it was founded in the late 70s. And what happened to each of its leaders is more brutal, more twisted, and more cinematic than any television series. Stay with me, because some of these fates are ones you've never heard before. And there's one in particular, the story of El Güero Palma, that will leave you frozen. To understand how they ended, you have to understand how they began. The Guadalajara Cartel was born between 1978 and 1980 when a group of traffickers from Sinaloa regrouped in Jalisco after fleeing Operation Condor, an anti-substance program that devastated the crops of the Golden Triangle. 3 men led that reorganization: Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, a former federal police officer with a sharp business instinct; Rafael Caro Quintero, a visionary farmer from Badiraguato; and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, the patriarch of the group, with more than 20 years of experience in the trade. Together, they built a monopoly that controlled virtually all substance trafficking in Mexico. Green substance, poppy-based substance, and later South American white substance. They moved fortunes that would be unimaginable today. But here's what almost nobody talks about. That cartel didn't just have 3 founders. From its ranks emerged other names that later became legends: Amado Carrillo Fuentes, Juan José Esparragoza Moreno, Hector Luis Palma Salazar, Joaquín Guzmán Loera. They all came through the Guadalajara school. They all learned the rules of the business there, and almost all of them met the worst possible end. Let's go one by one and pay close attention to the details, because in each story there's something you won't find anywhere else. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the boss of bosses. This man was different from all the rest. He didn't come from the countryside or from extreme poverty like most traffickers from Sinaloa. Born on January 8, 1946 in Culiacán, he was a federal police officer who moved among politicians and businessmen as if he were one of them. He wore designer suits, spoke with refinement, and understood finance. He was the one who had the vision to unite all of Mexico's traffickers under a single command, creating something that functioned almost like a multinational corporation. They called him El Padrino, and for nearly a decade that's exactly what he was. The man who decided who trafficked, through which routes, and how much each one paid. His network of contacts was staggering. He had ties to the Federal Directorate of Security, the Mexican intelligence agency that at the time served as a protective umbrella for organized crime. The DFS agents didn't just protect the cartel, they actively participated in its operations. That gave Felix Gallardo a layer of near-total impunity. But everything changed on February 7, 1985. That day, DFS agents abducted DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in broad daylight outside the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara. Camarena had been investigating the cartel's operations, and his work led to the destruction of a green substance plantation spanning over 1,000 hectares known as Rancho Buffalo in Chihuahua. Authorities burned more than 10,000 tons of merchandise. The organization lost around $160 million in a single blow. The response was so brutal that it triggered a diplomatic crisis between Mexico and the United States. Camarena was subjected to a violent interrogation lasting more than 30 hours. U.S. prosecutors documented that a doctor was tasked with administering substances to keep him conscious while he was beaten. His body and that of his pilot, Alfredo Zavala, were found weeks later on a ranch in Michoacán with clear signs of what had been done to them. Felix Gallardo managed to evade capture for 4 more years than his partners. He continued operating, trying to hold the organization together while Caro Quintero and Don Neto were already behind bars. But on April 8, 1989, he was finally arrested in his own home in Guadalajara. He was first imprisoned at the Reclusorio Sur, and from there, using a cell phone, he continued giving orders. He summoned his top lieutenants and divided the territories. Tijuana for the Arellano Felix brothers, who were his relatives. Juarez for Don Neto's nephews, the Carrillo Fuentes family. Sinaloa for El Chapo, El Mayo, and El Güero Palma. That division was the exact moment the modern map of substance trafficking in Mexico was born. But when he was transferred to the maximum security prison at Almoloya, his real power came to an end. And this is where the story becomes devastating. Today, Felix Gallardo is around 80 years old and remains imprisoned in Puente Grande, Jalisco. He is serving 2 sentences, one of 40 years for trafficking white substance, weapons stockpiling, and bribery, and another of 37 years for the Camarena case. The man who was once the most powerful criminal in Latin America lost an eye while in prison, went almost completely deaf, has been diagnosed with more than 22 medical conditions and suffers from severe depression. He spends his time doing gardening work inside the prison in exchange for a wage of 400 pesos per week. Prison authorities have said that the activity is mostly to keep the depression from consuming him entirely. A judge granted him house arrest in 2022, but the company responsible for the electronic monitoring bracelet canceled the contract, and Felix Gallardo never left. The United States firmly opposes his release. His defense team has filed injunctions alleging that federal authorities are deliberately obstructing the process. In May 2025, the former cartel leader filed a legal motion for the Supreme Court to take up his case. In one of the few interviews he has given in years, he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. "I am a corpse just waiting to be buried at the root of a tree. I have no life expectancy left. I lost everything. My senses, my hearing, my sight." The boss of bosses didn't fall to a bullet or in a spectacular operation. He faded slowly over more than 3 decades in a cell. Rafael Caro Quintero, the greatest trafficker of them all. If Felix Gallardo was the business brain, Caro Quintero was the agricultural visionary. Born on October 24, 1952 in Badiraguato, Sinaloa, he lost his father at 14. He was one of 10 siblings in a farming family that barely survived. He grew up cultivating corn and beans until he discovered that the green substance was the crop that would lift him out of poverty. Unlike others who relied on brute force, Rafael understood the land like no one else. He was the one who designed the industrial-scale plantations that turned the cartel into a money-generating machine. Rancho Buffalo, that plantation of over 1,000 hectares in Chihuahua, was his agricultural masterpiece. But he was also the one who, blinded by rage after the destruction of Rancho Buffalo, made the decision that destroyed everything. Caro Quintero wanted revenge against the DEA, and that revenge was Camarena. The order to abduct him and subject him to that violent interrogation came, according to U.S. investigations, directly from him. After the crime, he fled Mexico. On March 17, 1985, 40 days after Camarena's death, he departed from Guadalajara's airport on a private jet bound for Costa Rica. Former police officer Armando Pavon Reyes, head of the Judicial Police, allowed him to escape in exchange for a bribe of $300,000. In Costa Rica, he settled into a luxurious estate in Alajuela alongside his girlfriend Sara Cosio, the daughter of the former Secretary of Education of Jalisco. The DEA was searching for him desperately. The lucky break came when they intercepted a phone call. Sarah had contacted her family and told them, "I'm not kidnapped. I'm in love with Caro Quintero." That one sentence was enough. On April 4, 1985, Costa Rican agents and the DEA captured him. They found him with Sarah, who was half-dressed and apparently pregnant. They also seized weapons encrusted with diamonds. He was immediately extradited to Mexico. He served 28 years in various Mexican prisons. But on August 9, 2013, something happened that the DEA considered a slap in the face. A Mexican court released him on a legal technicality, arguing that the Camarena case should have been tried in state court, not federal. He walked out of prison at 2 in the morning in complete silence. The United States reacted with fury. They placed him on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list and offered $20 million for his capture, the highest reward in history for a cartel member, second only to the $25 million offered for Osama bin Laden. But Caro Quintero didn't retire to a quiet life. He retreated deep into the mountains of Sonora and, according to authorities, founded the Caborca Cartel, entering a direct war with Los Chapitos for control of the northwestern border. For 9 years, he was a ghost operating from the mountains. Until July 15, 2022, during a Mexican Navy operation in the municipality of Schwa, Sinaloa, a tracking dog named Max found him hiding among the brush in a rural area. He was recaptured and sent to the Altiplano prison. And then came the final chapter. On February 27, 2025, in an unprecedented operation involving more than 3,500 security personnel, 342 vehicles and 20 aircraft, Mexico handed over 29 high-profile cartel members to the United States. Caro Quintero was among them. Despite a district judge having granted him a stay to prevent his transfer, the Mexican government carried out the handover under a national security provision that allowed expulsion without going through the formal extradition process. The following day, he appeared before a federal judge in Brooklyn and pleaded not guilty. Today, at 73 years old, he is held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn under extreme isolation measures. A cell of roughly 2 meters by 2, round-the-clock camera surveillance, and 23 hours of solitary confinement per day. U.S. prosecutors confirmed in late 2025 that they will not seek the death penalty, honoring implicit agreements tied to his transfer. But the charges he faces, leadership of a continuing criminal enterprise, large-scale trafficking of controlled substances, and the taking of Agent Camarena's life, carry a mandatory minimum sentence of life in prison. His defense team has alleged that the isolation conditions are endangering his life. Curiously, he lives under the same roof, though in separate units, as Ismael El Mayo Zambada, co-founder of the Sinaloa Cartel. The next court hearing is scheduled for March 19, 2026. The greatest trafficker of them all went from being the most wanted man in the world to spending his final years locked inside a U.S. prison, awaiting a sentence he already knows. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Don Neto. Don Neto was the oldest of the 3 founders and in many ways the most enigmatic. Born on August 1, 1930 in Santiago de los Caballeros, Badiraguato, he entered the criminal world before anyone else. His first arrest came on April 4, 1955 in Mexicali, Baja California, when he was found carrying buckets of raw poppy paste after an armed confrontation with police. He was just 24 years old and already trafficking. After that, he became a mentor to an entire generation. Pedro Avilés, known as the Lion of the Sierra, Juan José Esparragoza, El Azul, and Caro Quintero himself. He was the advisor, the patriarch, the man who knew how things worked because he had been doing them for decades. When the Guadalajara Cartel was founded, Don Neto took on the role of senior advisor. He wasn't the one negotiating with the Colombians or overseeing the plantations. He was the one who restored order when things got heated. But the Camarena case dragged them all down. According to investigators, the violent interrogation of the DEA agent took place, at least in part, at a property linked to Don Neto. U.S. prosecutors accused him of planning and directing the abduction alongside Felix Gallardo and Caro Quintero, with the participation of a doctor who kept the victim conscious for more than 30 hours. He was arrested on April 7, 1985 at a luxurious mansion in Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco, by elements of the Mexican army. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He passed through some of Mexico's toughest facilities: Reclusorio Norte, the Altiplano, and the Western Penitentiary. In January 2017, he paid a compensation of 20.8 million pesos to the families of Camarena and Zavala, and beginning in July 2016, when he was already 86 years old and suffering from severe arthritis, a colon tumor, and more than a dozen additional illnesses, a judge granted him house arrest. He spent the final 9 years of his sentence at a residence in the Hacienda Valle Escondido subdivision in Atizapan, state of Mexico, monitored by closed-circuit cameras and federal agents around the clock. On April 5, 2025, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo completed his full sentence, 40 years exactly, and he was released. At 95, he became the longest-lived cartel member in Mexican history to regain his freedom after serving his entire sentence. But the story didn't end there. The US DEA maintains an active fugitive warrant for him, describing him as armed and dangerous, despite the fact that Mexico released him legally. The family of Agent Camarena filed a federal civil lawsuit in the Southern District of California accusing him, along with Caro Quintero and Felix Gallardo, of international terrorism and premeditated taking of life. And as soon as he regained his freedom, Don Neto filed an injunction against the Mexican government demanding the return of his assets and bank accounts that had been seized since 1985, though a judge refused to admit it. According to medical reports and statements from his daughter, he is battling colon cancer, hypertension, severe rheumatism, partial paralysis on the right side of his body, and advanced cognitive decline. His daughter, Joanna, has said publicly that her father no longer even knows what year it is. At 95 years old, free but destroyed by 4 decades of imprisonment, Don Neto is living proof that even freedom can arrive too late. He is the uncle of Amado and Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, the leaders of the Juarez Cartel. His criminal lineage remains active even though he can no longer remember his own name. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies. And this is where the story of the Guadalajara Cartel branches into one of the greatest mysteries in organized crime across Latin America. Because Amado Carrillo wasn't a founder of the cartel, but he grew up inside it. He was the direct nephew of Don Neto, and it was Don Neto who brought him into the business as a teenager. Born on December 17, 1954 in Guamuchilito, Navolato, Sinaloa, though he was raised in a small village called Revolcadero in Badiraguato. He was sent to Ojinaga, Chihuahua, to learn the border operations under the guidance of Pablo Acosta and Rafael Aguilar Guajardo. When the cartel fragmented, Amado didn't inherit just any territory. He inherited Juarez, the most strategic of them all, and turned it into the most powerful white substance corridor on the continent. They called him the Lord of the Skies because he operated a fleet of Boeing 727 aircraft to transport tons of merchandise from Colombia to Mexico. We're not talking about small planes. We're talking about full-size commercial jets loaded to capacity. According to the DEA, his organization generated between $200 and $300 million per week. His personal fortune was estimated at $25 billion. To put that in perspective, that would have placed him among the wealthiest people on the planet. And unlike Pablo Escobar, who constantly put himself in the spotlight, Amado had learned the lesson by watching how fame destroyed the Colombian. He was discreet to the point of obsession. Very few journalists dared to write about him while he was active. 1% of the cartel's weekly earnings was allocated exclusively to bribes. But in 1997, everything fell apart. 2 months before his death, his main ally, General José de Jesús Gutiérrez Rebollo, was arrested. Gutiérrez Rebollo was none other than Mexico's top anti-substance official, a military officer with a reputation for being tough and incorruptible who had led dozens of operations against minor traffickers. The United States had publicly endorsed him, but it turned out the whole thing was a facade. He was working directly for Amado. His arrest exposed the cartel's protection network and left Carrillo completely vulnerable. And then he made the decision that took his life, or made him disappear. It depends on who you ask. On July 3, 1997, under the false name Antonio Flores Montes, he checked into the hospital Santa Monica in Polanco, Mexico City. 9 surgeons, led by Dr. Ramon Lopez Saucedo, performed a liposuction that extracted more than 14 liters of fat, along with a complete facial reconstruction that included deliberate fractures to the jaw to reshape his face. The procedure lasted more than 8 hours. 2 of his bodyguards remained in the operating room throughout. According to medical reports, the surgery was successful. But in the early hours of July 4th, in room 407 of the hospital, the patient woke up in pain and was given a sedative called dormicum, whose active ingredient is midazolam. He suffered a cardiorespiratory arrest. He was officially pronounced dead that morning. Mexican authorities took nearly a week to confirm the identity of the body. They transferred it to the Central Military Hospital, where fingerprint tests were conducted and independently verified by the DEA. They ultimately confirmed it was him. His body was handed over to the family and flown to Sinaloa in a small aircraft, inside a black bag because the coffin didn't fit in the plane. But here's what fuels the legend and has never been resolved. 4 months after his death, the bodies of the 3 lead surgeons were found inside steel drums filled with cement, with clear signs of violent interrogation. That set off every theory imaginable. Phil Jordan, a former DEA agent, suggested that Amado was taken out with a lethal injection after a surgery that had gone well. Mexican anti-substance prosecutor Mariano Herrán Salvati stated in 1998 that the Juarez cartel itself ordered his elimination because they considered him a liability. And a close friend of the cartel leader, a man named Sosimo, who grew up with him in Revolcadero, declared years later that at the funeral viewing he noticed the body didn't match. The skin tone was dark when Amado was fair-skinned. A distinctive white streak of hair was missing. A well-known scar on his hand was absent, and the mustache was still intact, which would make no sense if his entire face had been reconstructed. The body was cremated after the funeral, eliminating any possibility of future verification. Jesus Reynaldo Zambada, known as El Rey, brother of El Mayo Zambada and a former close associate of Amado, confirmed in an interview years later that his brother had informed him of the cartel leader's death and explained that he had passed away from complications related to anesthesia. But the shadow of doubt never lifted. To this day, there are those who maintain that the Lord of the Skies faked his own death, went through with the surgery, changed his face, and vanished forever. What is certain is that he left behind 28 recognized children, a cartel that sank into internal wars under the command of his brothers Vicente and Rodolfo, and the eternal question of whether he truly rests underground or lives with a different face somewhere in the world. Juan José Esparragoza Moreno, El Azul. Of all the cartel leaders who passed through the Guadalajara Cartel, none was as discreet, as intelligent, or as elusive as El Azul. They called him that because his skin was so dark it appeared to have a bluish tone. Born in Huixiopa, Badiraguato, in February 1949, before becoming a cartel member, he was a detective for the now-defunct Federal Directorate of Security. He knew both sides of the coin from the inside. He understood how traffickers operated and also how police officers thought. Esparragoza was not a man of war. He was a strategist, a mediator. They called him the peacemaker because he had the unique ability to sit rival cartel leaders at a table and broker agreements that benefited everyone. It was he who, in the 90s, mediated between the Juarez cartel and the Gulf cartel, creating what became known as the Peace of the North, an arrangement that lasted years until El Chapo escaped from prison and wanted to control everything. It was also he who, according to testimony from El Chapo's trial in Brooklyn, warned Guzman Loera that the Arellano Felix brothers were waiting for him at the Guadalajara airport to take him out. That day, in May 1993, the hitmen mistook Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo for El Chapo and gunned him down. A mistake that changed the history of organized crime in Mexico. El Azul was arrested in March 1986 in Mexico City on charges of trafficking controlled substances and for his alleged connection to the Camarena case. But unlike the 3 founders, he served only 7 years in prison. He was released in 1992 and joined the Juarez cartel as second-in-command to Amado Carrillo. After the death of the Lord of the Skies, he aligned with the Sinaloa faction and became the 3rd pillar of the Sinaloa cartel alongside El Chapo and El Mayo. His web of family connections was astonishing. He married El Chapo's sister-in-law, was the godfather of one of Amado Carrillo's children, and one of his sons is married to a daughter of the Beltran Leyva family. Connected by blood or marriage to every major criminal family, respected by all, an enemy to none. And then, he vanished. On June 7, 2014, the Sinaloa newspaper Rio Doce, one of the most reliable sources on organized crime in northern Mexico, reported that El Azul had passed away. According to the accounts gathered by the outlet, Esparragoza had suffered a car accident weeks earlier that severely damaged his spinal column. While resting in bed, he attempted to get up and suffered a massive heart attack. He was 65 years old. But there's an enormous problem. Not a single piece of evidence exists to prove that it happened. There's no death certificate. There's no police report of the car accident. No one knows at which hospital he passed away. Some sources say Mexico City, others say Guadalajara, others say Culiacan. His family supposedly cremated him the following day, destroying all evidence. The then Attorney General, Jesus Murillo Caram, declared from Madrid that they had found no evidence to confirm the death. Months later, his son José Juan Esparragoza Jiménez was arrested and told a judge that his father had indeed passed away. But authorities never verified it. And here's the detail that changes everything. To this day, more than a decade later, both the FBI and the DEA maintain an active fugitive file for El Azul, with a $5 million reward for information leading to his capture. In 2005, he was the second most wanted man by the FBI, behind only Osama bin Laden. The DEA believes he faked his death, possibly with the help of plastic surgery, and that he lives quietly somewhere, believing that no one is looking for him anymore. He is the perfect ghost of Mexican substance trafficking. Neither alive nor dead, simply vanished. Hector Luis Palma Salazar, El Güero Palma. And now we arrive at the most brutal story of all those that emerged from the Guadalajara Cartel. Not because of how El Güero ended up, but because of what was done to him before it was all over. Hector Palma was born on April 29, 1960 in Noria de Abajo, Mocorito, Sinaloa. He was blonde with blue eyes in a world where most men were dark-skinned. That's where the nickname came from. He started out stealing cars and quickly caught the attention of Felix Gallardo, who recruited him as an enforcer in the 70s. He rose fast within the organization and became close friends with a young Joaquin Guzman Loera. Together they operated within the Guadalajara Cartel until the fall of Felix Gallardo shattered everything. But during that fragmentation, El Güero was accused of keeping a shipment of merchandise that belonged to El Padrino, and the retaliation that followed broke every unwritten rule that existed in the criminal world. Felix Gallardo, from prison, and the Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel planted a Venezuelan operative named Rafael Caro Moreno. The operation was meticulous and calculated in its cruelty. Clavel first became El Güero's business partner, earning his trust. Then he got close to Palma's sister and married her. And finally, while El Güero was traveling along the cartel's routes, Clavel approached Guadalupe Leja Serrano, Palma's wife, seduced her and convinced her to leave her husband. Guadalupe withdrew $2 million from El Güero's account and fled with Clavel to San Francisco. And there, in a hotel, Clavel took her life. But that wasn't all, and it wasn't the worst of it. Clavel sent El Güero the head of Guadalupe inside a box, and days later he sent him a video recorded in Venezuela showing how the couple's two children, 4-year-old Natalie and 5-year-old Hector, were thrown from the Concordia Bridge, a structure over 150 meters tall in San Cristobal. That act changed the rules of substance trafficking in Mexico forever. Until then, there had been an unwritten pact. Women and children were untouchable. After what was done to El Güero, that rule ceased to exist. What followed was a hunt that lasted years. Palma ordered the elimination of Clavel, of his 3 children, of the Tijuana cartel's attorney who participated in the operation, and of several members of the Arellano Felix family. Clavel was arrested in Venezuela for the crime against the children, but he was taken out inside the prison under circumstances that no one ever clarified. Everyone knows who gave the order. On June 23, 1995, El Güero was traveling in a private jet from Ciudad Obregón to Guadalajara to attend a wedding when the aircraft ran out of fuel and crashed on the border between Jalisco and Nayarit. He survived the impact, eliminated the 2 pilots, and was aided by PGR agents in white trucks. But the following day, he was located and captured by elements of the Mexican army. He was imprisoned in Puente Grande, Jalisco, and later extradited to the United States, where he served a 16-year sentence. He was released in June 2016 for good behavior. But the moment he set foot on Mexican soil, he was transferred to the Altiplano prison for the taking of 2 Nayarit police officers' lives during the events surrounding his capture in 1995. In 2023, a court ordered his release on the grounds that prosecutors lacked sufficient evidence to support the charge of organized criminal activity. But hours later, a separate court order appeared that kept him inside. Today, at 65 years old, Hector Luis Palma Salazar remains locked up in the Altiplano. He has spent more than 3 decades behind bars. The man whose wife and children were taken from him in the most savage way imaginable was never able to give them a proper burial. He built a mausoleum valued at $420,000 at the Jardines del Humaya Cemetery in Culiacan. But he was never able to visit it as a free man. Of the 6 main leaders of the Guadalajara Cartel we just covered, none met their end in combat or was taken out by rivals in the way you might imagine. Felix Gallardo wastes away in a cell doing gardening work. Caro Quintero awaits life in prison in Brooklyn. Don Neto walked free at 95 without even knowing his own name. Amado Carrillo vanished on an operating table surrounded by mystery. El Azul became a ghost that not even the FBI can confirm exists. And El Güero remains behind bars, trapped in a legal limbo between 2 countries. The organization they founded didn't end in a hail of gunfire. It ended with its leaders slowly consuming themselves, victims of the very system they created. And the most disturbing part is that the Guadalajara Cartel never disappeared. It multiplied. From it came Sinaloa, Tijuana, Juarez. And from those came the CJNG, Los Zetas, the Beltran Leyva. The Hydra keeps severing heads and growing new ones.